بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك إني كنت من الظالمين يا حي يا قيوم برحمتك أستغيث رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله. So today I'll be discussing Islam and some interesting connections with neuroconstructivism. It's a concept that's been around since 2007, and I only discovered this a couple of years ago, actually. Well, 3 years ago. I was reading this book I stumbled across called Culture, Mind and Brain Emerging Concepts, Models and Applications. A fascinating book simply because it connects culture, the mind, and various concepts that allows us to understand, embrace, absorb and practice culture, and some practical case studies and how various cultures, for example Mexico, Latin America and Europe, though they may speak one language such as Spanish, the cultures still vary. And of course this is the fact of colonization, changes in political order, new people coming in, the natives being disappeared, so on and so forth. So I was reading the chapter on social interaction and the extended nervous system, right here. Hopefully you can see. This is on page 285, and I was just flicking over in this chapter. This one was just speaking about cooperation and competition, social skills, and the neurological underpinnings of why such things happens in competing or different cultures, and came across this diagram which quoted the Neuroconstructivism paper by Gert and Dennis and colleagues. So I thought, you know what? Excuse me. I thought, why not explore this in depth and understand what the Quran has to say in connection with how we develop our understanding, and how it's argued in terms of neuroconstructivism that nothing is innate, very minimal actually is innate, is mostly due to us navigating and reaching out to our environment. And when we do reach out to environment, that allows us to learn and enhance our understanding. So managed to find the paper, but before I begin, there is an ayah of the Quran that really struck me whilst I was trying to find similarities. There are actually a few ayahs here, but the role of experience and environment when it comes to cognitive development is of primary interest. Okay, and so I came across Surah Al-Nahl, ayah 78, so that would be chapter 16, verse number 78, and it's the following. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والله أخرجاكم من بطون أمهاتكم لا تعلمون شيئا وجعل لكم السمع والأبصار والأفئدة لعلكم تشكرون. صدق الله العظيم. So in English that would approximate to, it is He, Allah, who brought you forth from the wombs of your mothers when ye knew nothing, and He gave you hearing and sight and intelligence and affection, that you may give thanks to Allah. Excuse me. So this is quite interesting, given the fact that we knew nothing at one point, in this case in our mother's wombs, and once we were born thereafter, Allah gave us the ability, or most of us, the ability to hear and see, and intelligence and affection. So we see not a contrast but a connection between the aql, the intelligence, and also the emotional aspect, right? So at the end of the day, it seems that the Quran is here in this case saying that nothing was innate in terms of your intelligence and your ability to understand what is being heard by your brain, your heart, and your soul, and what you see by the same systems. But in fact, it's a situation where once you're in the world, i.e., an environment, and you see around you and you use your senses, you are able to grasp certain information. Now, we do not take a reductionist view, right? We do not believe there is no innateness. Of course, as Muslims, we believe in the fitrah and the fact that we do possess innate knowledge. However, there are situations where we don't necessarily have specific innate knowledge, but we do have the general innate knowledge. So what do I mean? We generally have the ability to recognize bad, but specifically, if you were to put a few case studies in front of various cultures and various individuals with different experiences, political leanings, and opinions, you'll get a slightly different result in terms of what is seemed to be bad. Everyone agrees murder is bad, but is the killing of, for example, someone who has abused a family member of yours bad? Right? So it's these aspects that once you grasp and understand and hear and see and everything else, you're able to make a value judgment. Anyway, so today, inshallah, we will be breaking down and analyzing this paper because I find it very, very fascinating. There's not a lot I could find online, so I thought, as a Muslim, it's my duty to share knowledge that is not available in terms of someone who can break down and explain it in lucid language to the layperson, right? So this is the paper here, and inshallah we'll be breaking this down. So, abstract: Neuroconstructivism. Neuroconstructivism is a theoretical framework focusing on the constructions of representations in the developing brain. That's the ayah I began with, because it's the development. Okay. Cognitive development is explained as emerging from the experience-dependent development of neural structures supporting mental representations. Neural development occurs in the context of multiple interacting constraints acting on different levels, from the individual cell to the external environment of the developing child. Cognitive development can thus be understood as a trajectory originating from the constraints on the underlying neural structures. Excuse me. This perspective offers an integrated view of normal and abnormal development, as well as development and adult processing, and it stands apart from traditional cognitive approaches in taking seriously the constraints on cognition inherent to the substrate that delivers it. So, what does that mean? So, cognitive development, the authors are saying, is best explained as one of those emerging paradigms, right? We spoke in one of the previous videos regarding paradigms. From the experience dependent, so we have the subject object situation here. Subject is the experience and the dependency being the object. So experience dependent, scent, taste, smell, music, so on and so forth. Although I do not recommend music, but the reason I mention is because there are differing sounds upon which we hear them. We can recognize the artist, the song, the language, so on and so forth. Or poetry as well, if it's prose or verse, so on and so forth. And so what the authors are saying is that this experience dependent paradigm that emerges from the development of neural structures that support mental representations. Now, this is a bit vague because they, at the moment, do not really go into detail. I assume they will as we read the paper, right? Because instantly my two questions are, how are these neural structures developed, the exact mechanism and processes? And number two, supporting mental representations. These neural structures are being alluded to, supporting mental representation. So the second question is, how do we know it's supporting these mental representations? What's the methodology? What's the approach? What are the techniques through which it's measured for us to know it supports these mental representations, right? So it's very vague, as I mentioned, to just simply say this, but hopefully they break it down. If not, then heard it here first. Neural development occurs in the context of multiple interacting constraints acting on different levels, from the individual cell to the external environment of the developing child. Now, constraints has a multimodal meaning here. So constraints can act as something that may stress, may suppress, may delineate, or may shift the direction of a particular developmental process. So the idea here is to understand the constraint, number one, or the number of constraints we're dealing with, and the levels it will go to. Now, again, they haven't mentioned levels. They simply said from the individual cell to the external environment of the developing child. Yeah, but the individual cell is so complicated. The environment is not as complicated, but just as complicated in terms of understanding from the minute to the more bigger picture stuff. So cognitive development can thus be understood as a trajectory originating from the constraints on the underlying neural structures. So these underlying neural structures, which seemingly support our mental representations, the authors are saying that cognitive development is understood as a trajectory from the constraints. So bypassing these constraints, embracing and absorbing them, don't know so far, on the underlying structure. So it's essentially, the way I'm picturing it right now is like a logarithmic graph. It's curved, it's exponential increase in a sense. And it has to be an increase because at the end of the day, the amount of data we are receiving from the moment you watch this video and everything you will experience after this video and whatever you had experienced before this is all part of this process of cognitive development. So this perspective offers an integrated view of normal and abnormal development, as well as of development and adult processing. Excuse me. And it stands apart from traditional cognitive approaches in taking seriously the constraints in cognition inherent to the substrate that delivers it. So there is a substrate that seemingly exists. How do they know? How do they justify this type of thinking? We'll see in a second. Because just touching on the ayah of the Quran here briefly, we know now that the child in the mother's womb is able to recognize voices and has the ability to exercise its senses in certain situations, right? There is a very well-known study where a child turns its head whilst in the mother's womb just by looking at three dots that seemingly mimic to a degree the human face, right? And I will attach this on the screen so you can see this article, the study, and it's from the UK. It's quite a fascinating study, and subhanallah, there's they know words to really put, at least to describe words to put and at least describe the miracle of childbirth and how human beings are created. It's truly remarkable. Anyway, introduction. One of the greatest challenges in developmental psychology is to explain the mechanisms of cognitive change. However, much of developmental psychology is concerned with exploring children's abilities at specific ages without devoting equal attention to the question of the mechanisms by which these abilities unfold and change over time. Explaining cognitive change requires a theory that can link the observed abilities of infants and children at different ages into one developmental trajectory. There is a well-known hadith of Muhammad ﷺ that once your child reaches puberty, be more stern and strict when it comes to salah, and before that, don't be too strict. Paraphrasing here, of course, and I will attach the hadith I am alluding to, so you can view that on the screen, inshallah. It's well-known hadith, and we are forbidden even to beat our children. So there are many cultures, going back to culture, neuroscience, cognitive development, how certain external stresses, external changes do have an effect on our cognitive development. May Allah guide us all. Ameen. A central tenet of the neuroconstructivist approach is a focus on the factors that influence the emergence of mental representation in postnatal development. Representations are here defined as neural activation patterns in the brain that contribute to adaptive behavior in the environment. Therefore, understanding cognitive development requires an understanding of how the neural substrate supporting mental representations are shaped. Yeah, that's exactly what I highlighted earlier. I want to understand how these processes and the substrate that the authors are mentioning support mental representation, and what approach are they taking, the methodology and the techniques used. Neuroconstructivism views the development of these neural systems as heavily constrained by multiple interacting factors, intrinsic and intrinsic to the developing organism. From this perspective, the cognitive developmental trajectory occurs in the context of the constraints operating on the development of the brain. These constraints span multiple levels of analysis, from genes and the individual cell to the physical and social environment of the developing child. However, we shall see it is possible to identify common principles that operate across all these levels. Now, need to highlight a sentence mentioned here because one thing sprung to mind instantly, which is gene environment interaction and gene environment correlation. Two different yet distinct things. So just to repeat one of the sentences, which is, from this perspective, the cognitive development trajectory occurs in the context of the constraints operating on the development of the brain. These constraints span multiple levels of analysis, from genes and the individual cell to the physical and social environment of the developing child, right? So I've made a few notes because I came across, I think it's David or Daniel Ritter. He's I believe, social psychologist from America, and I came across one of the concepts in his paper. I shall inshallah attach that reference as well. And I made a few notes actually, because I think it's important that we understand this, and together we can grasp what's exactly being said here. So, gene environment interaction and gene environment correlation. So, gene environment interaction and gene environment correlation describe how genes and environment influence human traits and behavior, but they differ in how they operate. Now, gene environment interaction, GXE, this occurs when the same genetic makeup produces different outcomes depending on the environment. In other words, genes and the environment work together to shape a trait, and one's environment can activate or suppress genetic tendencies. For example, imagine two children with a genetic tendency for anxiety. One grows up in a calm, supportive home and learns coping skills, leading to low anxiety. Okay? The other one grows up in a stressful, abusive home, which triggers their genetic predisposition, leading to high anxiety. Caspi and colleagues studied the 5-HTTLPR gene, which is linked to serotonin, and found that people with a certain gene variant were more likely to develop depression only if they experienced childhood stress or trauma. Those with the same gene but without stress were not affected. So I think this is something most of us understand, but don't really understand in terms of the science behind it and the scientific classification of this being a gene environment interaction. Next is gene environment correlation. This is denoted with a small r, capital G, capital E. This refers to the way genes influence the environment people experience it. It suggests that people do not experience environments randomly, rather genes shape behaviors, which in turn shape environments. There are three types. So, we have passive correlation. So, parents provide both genes and environment. Okay, for example, a child of athletic parents inherits genes for physical fitness and also grows up in a home full of sports equipment and encouragement. The result, the child is more likely to become athletic, but is it genes or environment? Possibly both. Evocative correlation. A person's genetic traits evoke responses from others. For example, a child who's naturally outgoing gets more positive social feedback, more invitations, leadership roles, and reinforcing their social skills. Number 3 is active correlation. Okay. People seek environments that match their genetics. For example, a musically talented child chooses to join the school band, enhancing their musical skills further. Scar and McCartney in Childhood Development outline these three types of correlations, explaining how genetic predisposition shape the environment people experience. Okay, so it's really fascinating that it's not simply a case of, oh yeah, my genes made me do it, which is a famous phrase, and it's unjust to simply put everything into one box. You have to classify them and approach them at a certain angle, and that's the beauty of science, unlike the Qur'an, which is solid and as clear as it can ever be. Going back to the paper, although this approach to cognitive development might seem to advocate reductionism by attempting to explain cognitive change on the neural level, such an interpretation would be misleading. Neural development, especially in the cerebral cortex, is often dependent on the neural activity, which can be mediated by experience with the environment. Therefore, cognitive processing itself shapes the neural networks that are responsible for this processing in the first place. These changes to the brain hardware in turn change the nature of representations and their processing, which leads to new experiences and further changes to the neural systems. Therefore, the basis of cognitive development can be excuse me. Therefore, the basis of cognitive development can be characterized by mutually induced changes between neural and cognitive levels. Right, okay. Importantly, this view implies a rejection of independent levels of description that are often advocated in cognitive psychology. Because algorithm and hardware change each other in development, they cannot be studied in isolation. Instead of independent levels of analysis or neural reductionism, neuroconstructivism calls for consistency between the neural and cognitive levels in characterizing developmental trajectories. Right, okay. The neuroconstructivist approach has been motivated by advances in developmental research that enable the investigation of cognitive and brain development in parallel. First, in the past 10 years, our ability to investigate the developing brain has progressed dramatically through the advent of sophisticated imaging methods such as ERP, MEG, fMRI, and IRS. Right, okay. Second, at the same time, new paradigms have been developed to examine the abilities of even very young infants in a variety of behavioral domains. And third, computational and robotic models have become established as a methodology to develop and test specific hypotheses of the interactions between brain and cognitive development. So, yeah, they're essentially setting the stage here for this particular theory. Right, so constraints on development. So before we move forward, there was another ayah of the Quran that I thought was quite fascinating that I wanted to also mention. So the gradual learning of the brain, the gradual nature of learning and development. So Surah Ghafir, Ayah 67. Right, this is a surah that I come across quite often. So that will be chapter number 40, verse 67. So chapter number 40, verse 67. Okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم هو الذي خلقكم من تراب ثم من نطفة ثم من علقات ثم يخرجكم طفلا ثم لتبلغوا أشدكم ثم لتكونوا شيوخا ومنكم من يتوفى من قبل ولتبلغوا أجلا مسمى ولعلكم تعقلون صدق الله العظيم. So this approximates to in English, it is He who has created you from dust, then from a sperm drop, then from a leech-like clot. Then does He get you out into the light as a child. The womb study I mentioned earlier. Striking similarity here. Then lets you grow and reach your age of full strength. Then lets you become old. Though of you there are some who die before. and lets you reach a term appointed, in order that you may learn wisdom. Constraints on development. In the neuroconstructivist framework, understanding constraints on neural development is a central aspect of understanding cognitive development. By taking into account constraints on all levels, from the gene to the environment, neuroconstructivism integrates different views of brain and cognitive development, such as number one, probabilistic epigenesis, which emphasizes the interaction between experience and gene expression. Gottlieb wrote a book on development, individual development, in the 90s. I didn't read all of it, but hopefully you get a chance to read it together. Epigenesis is the theory now generally held that an embryo develops progressively from an undifferentiated egg cell. Neuroconstructivism, which focuses on the experience-dependent elaboration of small-scale neural structures. This is by Quartz and Sejnowski. Okay, okay. Number three, the interactive specialization view of brain development, which stresses the role of interaction between different brain regions in functional brain development. Number four, embodiment views that highlight the role of the body in cognitive development. Okay, one could say how gait, of course, affects development. Gait, G-A-I-T, is scientific word for body movement, walking, for example. Analysis of gait. Okay, number five, the constructivist approach to cognitive development, Piaget 55, with its focus on the proactive acquisition of knowledge. And sixth, approaches focusing on the role of the social environment for the developing child. So these are the six main possible constraints that are factored in the theory of neuroconstructivism. Right, okay. Genes. Number one, genes. The traditional view of gene function holds that there is one directional flow of cause and effect from genes' DNA to RNA to the structure of proteins they encode. From this perspective, development consists in the progressive unfolding of information that is laid out in the genome. However, more recent research presents a subtler picture by showing that environment and behavioral influences play a fundamental role in triggering the expression of genes. I mean, here, naturally, my question is, okay, how about factoring aspects of personality, fear and angst, narcissism, optimism, disgust, disgust not as it's generally known, but disgust in terms of development of disgust from a narcissist point of view and an optimist point of view, right? So the point I'm making here is, in terms of disgust, is a narcissist might be disgusted at how they may appear. The more optimist type of individual is disgusted at how society is functioning. So again, this is not generally agreed upon. There are many contrasting views, but that's just what sprung to my mind right now. The probabilistic epigenesis view of development, which is Gottlieb's view, emphasizes that gene activity, instead of following a strictly pre-programmed schedule, is regulated by signals from the external and internal environment. And that development is therefore subject to two-directional interactions between the gene activity, neural activity behavior, and the environment. So for example, canaries and zebra finches, the expression of ZENK, Z-E-N-K, a gene involved in regulating synaptic plasticity and learning, has been found to be closely related to experience. The motor activity involved in singing has been shown to lead to a rapid increase of expression of this gene in motor areas, whereas hearing song induces expression of the same gene in parts of the auditory areas. Furthermore, the amount of expression varied with the specific songs that were experienced. It was greatest when birds heard songs of their own species and lower for songs from their other species. The results show that gene expression can be influenced in very specific ways by experience with the environment. Now, this is quite remarkable, subhanallah, how birds are able to factor in the role of social and environmental factors that shape their cognition, right? Because why would a bird, according to the paper mentioned here by Mello, Vicario and Clayton from 1992, I'll be interested to explore this paper. How were they able to, factor in aspects of environment whilst analyzing how birds from the same species were very receptive, therefore a greater expression of the ZENK gene as compared to those from other species, right? You know what the beautiful thing is? Allah has actually sent us messengers and prophets, peace be upon them all, from our own species. How do I know this? Well, if I go to the Qur'an, which actually alludes to this in, of course, in a better manner than I've just mentioned. If we go to chapter 23, okay, which is Surah Al-Mu'minun, and we go to verse 32, okay. So this is the importance of social and environmental influences and how we are more receptive. Similar to birds, but not exactly the same. And it's a shame and quite frankly a disservice to science that neuroscientists study rats, dogs, cats, birds, monkeys, chimpanzees, fish, and then extrapolate those findings and apply it to human beings as close as possible. There is a misconception that we are 90+% close to chimpanzees and monkeys. It's not the case. It's a few genetic. It's a few genes that are expressed in monkeys that are similar to us. It's not, for example, we have 100, they have 100, and 98 of humans match with that of monkeys. No, it's a scam. Darwinian evolution in of itself. But anyway, going to ayah number 32. Okay, and this is to a degree quite frightening given the fact that so many warnings over time, yet we still decide to disobey Allah. And I'm guilty of this from my past. May Allah forgive us all. Allahumma ajirni min an-nar. Ameen. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فأرسلنا فيهم رسولا منهم أن اعبدوا الله ما لكم من إله غيره أفلا تتقون. So this approximates to English as, and we sent to them a messenger from among themselves, same species, saying, worship Allah. Not exactly jinn, but an expression testifying the oneness of Allah. Say, worship Allah. Ye have no other God but Him. Will ye not fear Him? So instantly, as I mentioned earlier, discussed fear. The idea of fear has been not only inculcated but not remain isolated. It forms part of any theology. When I mean any theology, I mean of those prophets and messengers and their followers way before the well-known ones, right? Because we have to keep in mind from the Islamic perspective and points of view, there have been over 100,000 prophets and messengers, and Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the last one. But from Adam alayhi salam to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, all of them preach the same message, which is to worship Allah, fear Him, recognize the false Messiah. The reality is not this world, but the world that follows, the torment of the grave. And of course, along with this, systems, political systems, economic systems, education systems, mannerisms, etiquettes, relationship with your spouse, parents, children, grandparents, and so on. So it's this comprehensive system that Islam is basically built upon. And from this, of course, you can have disagreements in each system, but the approach will always remain through the Quran and the Sunnah of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So right now it's time for prayer. Inshallah, I'll come back and we will continue from itself. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. So we left off on the ayah from Surah Al-Mu'minun, and this was ayah number 32. So just to reiterate, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فأرسلنا فيهم رسولا منهم أن اعبدوا الله ما لكم من إله غيره أفلا تتقون. صدق الله العظيم. This approximates to English in, and we sent to them a messenger from among themselves, saying, worship Allah. You have no other God but Him. Will ye not fear Him? And the connection that was made was actually regarding birds. And studies by Mello, Vicaro, and Clayton from 1992 found and illustrated that the genes expressed when a specific species of birds heard songs from their own species, those genes were expressed greater than those birds who heard songs from species other than their own. And this is where I found a striking similarity between this portion of the ayah, where Allah says, and we sent to them a messenger from among themselves. And this is actually in reference to possibly Hud alayhi salam, according to Abdullah Yusuf Ali. I'll read what he mentions here at the footnote of this ayah. He says, if this refers to any particular prophet, it must be Hud, whose mission was to the Ad people, or to Saleh, whose mission was to the Thamud people. That is a sequence after Nuh in chapter 11, verses 50 to 60 and verses 61 to 68. But I think that as the name is not mentioned, we are to understand in general the type of post-flood prophets until we come later on to Moses and Jesus. The object here is not to recount the stories, but to show that the resistance of the wicked made no difference to the triumph of Allah's holy truth. Going back to the paper, another section mentioned here is encelment. I'm not familiar with what encelment is, so let's discover it together. The development of a neuron is constrained by its cellular environment throughout development. Even at the earliest stages of fetal development, the way in which a particular cell develops is influenced by molecular interactions with its neighboring cells. At later stages of development, neural activity, either spontaneously generated or derived from sensory experience, begins to play an important part in the formation of neural networks. This reminds me of Joaquin Foster's cognates concept, how information is packed in what he calls these densely, highly sophisticated, complex data particles called cognates. And these particles, if I'm not mistaken and if my memory serves me right, aid our nervous system and our cognition with memory in development of new skills and understanding the environment around us. Couldn't really grasp that concept personally because it was very abstract. And one thing about neuroscience I love is the abstract and metaphysics element that seems to be parallel, if not parallel, definitely sandwiched in between many findings and theories. Anyway, neural activity is responsible both for the progressive elaboration of neural connection patterns as well as their subsequent stabilization and loss. Right, so these are papers by, the one previously was by Schultz, Mysore and Quartz, and this one is by Quartz and Sejnowski. The remodeling of axonal and dendritic branches can occur rapidly with parallel progressive and regressive events. A higher rate of structural elaboration compared with retraction leads to a gradual overall increase in network complexity. Right, so a higher rate of structural elaboration compared with retraction leads to gradual overall increase in network complexity. So in order for us to understand this, we have to grasp what is being said here regarding remodeling. Two things. Number one, remodeling of axonal and dendritic branches, and number two, the parallel with progressive and regressive events. The paper mentioned here is Hua and Smith. So in fact, I'll take a note, and inshallah on the next edition I will do my utmost best in breaking down and exploring this with yourself. Progressive and regressive events. The specific role of neural activity in the formation of neural networks has been extensively studied in the development of ocular dominance columns, ODC. ODC are areas of primary visual cortex arranged in strips or patches where neurons selectively respond to inputs from only one eye. The initial formation of these columns is likely to be dependent on pre- and postnatal spontaneously generated neural activity. Feller and Scanziani, 2005. Okay. During a subsequent critical period, altered visual experience can lead to changes in ODC organization. Critical period, okay. For example, transiently closing one eye during early postnatal development results in shrinking of the columns responding to the closed eye and expansion of the columns responding to the open eye. So the closed eye, there's been evidence of shrinking, and the expansion of columns in the responding open eye. Right. This is during postnatal development, so after birth. Paper written by Antonini and Stryker and Hubel and Wiesel. Oh wow, okay. Hubel Wiesel, classical neuroscientists from the 60s. These results suggest that activity-based competition between neurons for synaptic connection is a driving mechanism in the establishment of precise connection patterns. Stryker and Strickland, 1984. Initially, the same cortical area is innervated by axons from both eyes via the thalamus. An activity-based competition leads to retraction of axons from one eye and elaboration of axonal branching from neurons from the other eye in each area. So this has been a slightly more comprehensive breakdown, with ODC being taken as the central study when it was mentioned earlier, the rapid parallel progressive and regressive events. That's what seems to me, actually. It's quite interesting. It's all to do with vision. All to do with vision. Subhanallah. Okay, from a neuroconstructivist perspective, these findings are important because they show how experiences can alter neural networks that support the processing of these experiences. Neural activation patterns that form representations in the neuroconstructivist sense are constrained by the morphology and connection patterns of their underlying neural structures. So activation patterns that form representations from a neuroconstructivist POV, point of view, are constrained by the morphology, the changes, and the connection patterns caused by the changes that now exist after morphological changes of the underlying neural structures. Okay. However, the activation pattern themselves lead to morphological change, thereby altering the constraints imposed on representations. The activation patterns themselves lead to morphological change, thereby altering the constraints imposed on representations. In this way, progressively more complex representations can be built by adapting the constraints, neural structures, to the experience, neural activation patterns of the individual. And there's a figure here, which before we explore, I need to read this one more time. However, the activation patterns themselves lead to morphological change, okay, thereby altering the constraints imposed on representations. In this way, progressively more complex representations can be built by adapting the constraints, neural structures, to the experience, neural activation patterns of the individual. Okay. So the figure here, and inshallah I'll post this on the screen, Encelment. Neural activation patterns corresponding to representations in the neuroconstructivist sense are constrained by their underlying neural structures, but in turn affect changes in these structures through experience dependent processes. The solid line from neural structures to neural activity, which is boxed by representations, indicates a constraining relationship, and the dashed line indicates the induction of change. Right, so to summarize this succinctly, what's essentially being proposed here, taking the ocular dominance columns as the central key concept here, is that experiments that were done and the studies done showed that covering one eye, leaving the corresponding open eye open, shows shrinkage in the closed eye and expansion of the right eye. By expansion and shrinkage, I'm referring to the ODCs, the columns that exist. And these findings were, according to this paper, shocking, because initially the same cortical area is innervated by axons from both eyes via the thalamus. So what do they mean by innervated? They mean that it supplies, the supply is the same for each eye, right? And activity-based competition leads to retraction of axons from one eye and elaboration of axonal branching for neurons from the other eye in each area. So one eye ends up getting more axonal branches than the other one, despite both of them being equal in terms of the innervations being received by the thalamus, right? Thalamus plays a key role in our sensory experiences and cognition, certainly in memory, in audio perception, visual perception, and if I'm not mistaken, pattern recognition as well. Studies with monkeys definitely show this. As far as my memory stretches, thalamus and the V1, V2, V3, V4 areas, and also how the thalamus is able to experience at times lesions, which are injuries possibly caused by stroke, blunt force trauma, so on and so forth. So according to figure 1, neural activity can be, for lack of a better word, changed, where representations are now morphed and are now perceived as not what it was meant to be pre-manipulation, you could say, or in this case pre-changes to the ODCs, right? And the ODCs are ocular dominance columns, which is quite fascinating. I have not come across ODCs personally, and so because of this changes in neural structure, there seems to be underlying neural structures that are constrained because of the changes, and these changes cause certain neural activity to create these representations, which in turn causes the brain regions to then receive information different than it would in a different circumstance. So it's certainly something to wrap your head around, no pun intended. So next section is embrainment. As the brain is embedded in a body, embodiment, so an individual functional brain region is embedded in a brain where it co-develops with other brain regions and this is figure 2, which I will also share on the screen in this moment once we discuss this. So this embrainment view, Johnson 2005, contrasts with a modular perspective which focuses on the development and function of specialized brain areas in isolation. So embrainment, okay, modular perspective, okay, focusing on the development and functioning of specialized brain areas in isolation. Okay. It is supported by neuroimaging studies suggesting that the functional properties of a brain region are strongly context sensitive and constrained by its interactions with other regions. For example, through feedback processes and top-down interactions. Feedback processes, okay, so what comes to my mind is HPA axis, which is the axis that loops feedback from your hypothalamus and within your hypothalamus. And the second thing mentioned, top-down interactions, just this reminds me of fixated attention and the hierarchy of the visual process. Friston and Price, 2001. Examples for the importance of inter-regional interaction in brain development can be found in studies with people who lack one sensory modality. For example, in people blind from an early age, the cortical area activated by braille reading corresponds to the primary visual cortex in sighted people. Wow, subhanAllah. I did not know that. So those who are blind from an early age, their cortical areas are activated by braille, which correspond to the primary visual cortex with people who have normal vision. Apparently, therefore, brain regions that normally process visual information can take on a different functional role in the absence of visual input. So it's a shift of roles. That this new role is functionally relevant was shown by transiently disrupting processes through transcranial magnetic stimulation, TMS. It's a method in neuroscience. It turned out that the TMS stimulation of the visual cortex disrupted the tactile identification of braille letters in the blind but not in sighted participants. Instead, sighted participants displayed disrupted visual performance after TMS stimulation of primary visual cortex. Okay. Interesting. So, alhamdulillah. So, the TMS stimulation, right, on the visual cortex disrupted tactile function, identification of the blind people. So they were unable to identify the braille, okay? But when they did this to visually normal people, it seemed to be a situation where their primary visual cortex was not permanently damaged, but it was disrupted. So, subhanAllah, despite having normal vision, there is a situation where your primary visual cortex can be compensated, even if it's temporarily. Alhamdulillah. Okay. Mm. Therefore, the adaptive development of the functional organization of cortical areas seem to depend strongly on the available sensory inputs. Right. So now they're talking about adaptation, right? And brain plasticity is a form of adaptation, but not entirely. And I have an ayah on this, which I'll mention in a second. Therefore, the adaptive development of the functional organization of cortical areas seem to depend strongly on the available sensory inputs, with the final organization emerging through interactive processes such as competition for cortical space. Right. So this is the competition they're speaking about earlier, where a competition in terms of neural connection patterns has a huge effect on the neural structures and the constraints, and therefore the neural representations, and the neural representations affect the neural activity, and this in turn affects the brain regions when it comes to perception, as we saw in ocular dominance columns, ODCs. Right, okay. So far it makes sense, simply based off of the logic here. This interactive specialization view implies that cortical regions might initially be non-specific in their response, but gradually sharpen their response as their functional specialization restricts them to a narrower set of circumstances. Such a gradual sharpening of activated cortical regions for a specific process has, for example, been identified in word leanings and face processing. Wow. So, interactive specialization is the view which postulates that cortical regions might initially be non-specific in their response but gradually sharpen their responses as their functional specialization restricts them to a narrower and even narrower set of circumstances that they now have to essentially function and work with. I'm interested in understanding how they activate and then function once it's been restricted, and the post narrow timeline here could be interesting. Masters to pursue, I guess, cognitive neuroscience, understanding the gradual sharpening of activated cortical regions for a specific process. Some studies done here are identified in word learnings, Mills, Coffey, Carina, and Novell, and face processing, which I find quite remarkable, that certain regions of the brain eventually become so constrained and narrow that they focus on face processing. And this is a study that's the study quote here is by Passarotti, Paul, Rozier, Buxton, Wong, and Stiles, 2003. The interactive specialization view can be extended to account for the developmental integration of different and often cortical and subcortical brain regions for a specific ability. An integration of different brain areas has been used to explain behavioral change in the development of face recognition. Okay. Interesting. Object-oriented behavior, memory, categorization, habituation, speech, and language. So essentially the authors are saying, and there's a whole list of papers mentioned here, the interactive specialization view can be extended to account for developmental integration of different cortical and subcortical brain regions for a specific ability. So first they started with the idea that brain region is restricted, becomes narrower and narrower because of the competition for the cognitive space. Similar to, I guess you can say, free market capitalism. Eventually, in a specific niche, you have a handful of companies that dominate that niche, and it becomes so narrow because these days there are so many AI startups and companies around the world, and it's very vast. But as time will go on, it will become narrow and narrow, and there will be a handful of players in each niche: supply chain, manufacturing, communication, clinical trials, drug discovery, speech, visual assistance, brain mapping, so on and so forth, right? And so our system, according to the view, right, the interactive specialization view, is that a specific region becomes narrow, then it plays out a function, example, face processing and learning of words. However, at the same time, it can be extended to the point where cortical regions of the brain and subcortical regions of the brain can also be interacting together, in a sense intertwined, right? Intertwined, becoming interwoven with each other. And a cortical region, it could be, for example, the PFC, which is a prefrontal cortex, right? You have the medial lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe. So it seems to be where, for instance, vision, you have the medial lobe connected to the occipital lobe at the back. And when it comes to, for instance, if my memory serves me correct, the cerebellum, which is the brain stem area, just above the brainstem area, that cortical region. Then obviously you have the medulla, okay? They can also possibly be in tandem in terms of color and pattern recognition and emotional processing. Of course, the amygdala is well known for that. Fear is a famous emotion in terms of studies done on fear that show the amygdala processes fear, and the insula, which is another subcortical region, in a sense that processes disgust. But if you look at, for instance, the visual cortex and studies on vision, you have subcortical regions such as the superior and the inferior subcuticuli. So the subcuticuli are these two balls. They look a bit like Maltesers, the chocolate sweet, round, circular subcortical regions that essentially look like spheres. Two at the top, so that's the superior, and you have two at the bottom, just above the brainstem, so the top of the brainstem region, right? So when you are visually processing something, of course you have your rods and your cones, but before that you have your retina that processes the light, and the optic nerve sends that message, and then you have the optic chiasm, which then in a sense inverses what you're seeing. So everything I see from my right eye processed by the left side of my brain, and vice versa. And subcortical regions play a big role. Now the question is, are they narrowed because of cognitive data, the restriction of cognitive data, and trying to compete for space? I'm not sure. I haven't done any studies. I've only looked at the general literature on this. And is there a possibility? Maybe, because the examples given here are quite fascinating for me, and absolutely love to dive into them, because some of the examples mentioned here are an integration of different brain areas has been used. An integration of different brain areas have been used to explain behavioral change in the development of face recognition. Okay, object-oriented behavior, categorization, habituation, speech, and language. These are powerful processes that at the neural level are extremely complex. So for them to make these claims is quite big. But it's always interesting to see how these studies are done. If these are animal studies, personally, I don't take them as serious because, as I mentioned earlier in this video, it's impossible to extrapolate 100% findings in animals and then apply them on human beings completely. It's impossible. And it makes no sense. Though granted, many studies have helped. For example, studies in birds when it's in the context of navigation, and place cells, grid cells, the hippocampus, my favorite area of neuroscience in terms of navigation, neural mapping, cognitive maps. Studies in rats and mice in the same domain, and fish and cats and dogs. But yeah, you can't just apply that to human beings. That's just unfair. Anyway, embodiment. The mind exists within a body that is itself embedded in a physical and social environment. This fact both constrains and enhances the experiences of a developing child. Neural activation patterns are generated by sensory inputs, and therefore the functioning of the sensory organs has a highly constraining effect on the construction of representations in the mind. In this sense, the body acts as a filter for information from the environment. Two examples for this body as filter aspect of embodiment are the limited visual acuity and limited motor control of the young infant, which restrict the infant's possible sensory experiences and thus limit the potential complexity of representations at this developmental stage. It has been argued that the gradual loosening of the physical restrictions might be beneficial to allow for an orderly development trajectory with a gradual increase in the perceived complexity of the environment and resulting progressively complex representations. Now, an example of infants trying to integrate their behavior and explaining embodiment is an experiment that I find very fascinating, even though it's a very simple experiment, and it's called the visual cliff. The visual cliff essentially is where you have a glass platform, a table essentially, and it's see-through, and the baby can see a checkered design, and at the end of that particular platform is nothing. So the chances are, as the baby goes to the edge of this visual cliff, this edge, they can potentially topple and fall over. Now, what's been fascinating is in these studies, which they did with cats and then after that with infants, I believe in the 60s or 70s, I want to say, towards the late 20th century, right? The baby just knew that, okay, I'm looking at a pattern on this platform. However, as I move forward, right, I must also add that the same design that was under the glass was also extended to the bottom region, so there was no platform, right? So as the baby's going to the edge of the visual cliff, it can see the pattern, but it doesn't necessarily move over because it's noticed the difference in depth. So this is where in neuroscience the phrase depth perception is used to understand the depth, visually speaking, and how that is comprehended by an infant. And this is extremely important because when we, for example, in the physical sense, observe something that is deep or shallow, we can make this distinction based off of not only sensory experience, but also the fact that the brain is very plastic. It can change and shift its reception of the environment it has, right? And this reception stays within us till old age, can be changed. For example, habits can be changed. Your reading or writing skills can be changed. Certain physical activities can't. For example, someone who wants to play football at the age of 65, it's merely impossible. Wants to start wrestling at the age of 40, 45, it's going to be difficult. However, certain heavy cognitive actions, reading, learning a language, even an instrument, so on and so forth, can be taken on board because the cognitive load is higher than the physical load. Conversation, right? Let's look at the metaphysical. That's the physical example, visual cliff. Metaphysical. I don't agree with Descartes' I think, therefore I am, because that lies with the presupposition that there could be a case where I'm not, therefore I'm not, right? So I like Ibn Sina's perspective, which is you can't deny existence, right? Because denying existence is denying your brain's ability to adapt and be plastic. And I mentioned that an ayah from the Quran speaks of plasticity in the brain. So I like to go to chapter 47, okay? Ayah number 24. So chapter 47, Surah Muhammad, chapter 47, ayah 24. Ayah 24, okay, right. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أفلا يتدبرون القرآن أم على قلوب أقفالها صدق الله العظيم. This approximates to English as, do they not then earnestly seek to understand the Qur'an, or are their hearts locked up by them? Earnestly seek to understand. That's quite fascinating because we all seek to understand. However, that is very rare. Most of us seek for the sake of knowing. I know what's going on in world politics, for example. You probably would know more than me. But do you really understand what's happening in world politics? You probably know some verses from the Quran, but do you actually understand those verses from the Quran? You probably know more about neuroscience than me, but do you actually understand the neuroscience? So this is where the plasticity of the brain has a central role, and because of this central role, it allows us to form and process and execute and therefore understand the results of that entire process. It's akin to the amped process I mentioned in our previous video, and the whole idea is to have that methodological directive through which it can be measured, it could be systemized, it can be applied, it can be categorized in terms of its application, and the angle and the high level thinking that is required once you approach problem X, situation Y, or paper or book Z. So I really like that amped framework, and it seems to apply also in these findings. So embodiment, going back to the paper, is a powerful concept in neuroscience. And to be fair, without philosophy, it's extremely difficult to not only comprehend but come to grips with what exactly is this concept. Right. So, however, the developing body not only serves as a filter for information, but also as a means to manipulate the environment and to generate new sensory inputs and experiences. For example, even newborn infants will intentionally move their arm into a light beam, resulting in an illuminated spot on the limb that is not visible unless the limb is moved to the correct location. Study by van der Meer and van der Wiel in 1995, the reward for seeing the light spot completes a feedback loop between the infant and her environment, changing this environment to generate specific sensory inputs. At later ages, infants use their increased mobility and sensory motor coordination to explore and manipulate their environment, further generating ever more sensory inputs, which in turn lead to the modification of neural networks and to the construction of more complex representations. Figure 3. So I mentioned we'll touch on figure 2. I apologize, that was embrainment, but I think this is a nice segue into figure 3, which is embodiment. So just slightly going back, embrainment was, if you remember, the hyper constraints and the narrowing of our cortical and subcortical regions. So as you can see on your screen, and if you're following me with this paper, embrainment, two functional brain regions develop interactively. While each region is shaped by experience-dependent mechanisms, inter-regional interactions can alter the activity pattern within a region and thus the underlying neural structure in this region. In this way, one developing brain region can contribute to the nature of developing representations in another region. Solid lines indicate a constraining relationship and dashed indicate induction of change. Right, okay, so if you remember the superior and inferior superior and inferior subcolliculi, they seem to interact in tandem, in sync, according to this paper and neuroconstructivism, and this contributes to the developing nature of each region in terms of the representations that lie underneath them, which apparently come to surface as time goes on. So very straightforward, actually. I kind of explained it earlier, so alhamdulillah, that was very straightforward. Figure 3, embodiment, okay, which is the mind-body, one would say, dichotomy. I wouldn't call it paradox, I would call it nature, similar to the philosophy of dualism. Okay, so figure 3, embodiment. The brain is closely linked to its body and the environment. Body use, constrained by the body's morphology, can generate novel sensory experiences through altering the experience environment. Okay, this can be achieved either by moving the sensory organs, example given the eyes, without changing the external environment, or by manipulating the environment itself. The experienced environment generates neural activity which, through ensealment, leads to changes in the underlying and through enbrainment in other brain systems. Okay, for simplicity, different brain regions are here collapsed into one. Solid lines indicate constraining relationships and dashed lines indicate induction of change. Right, so automatically my brain now is thinking about VR goggles, Oculus Rift, the PlayStation VR, and all this other, I would say personally, nonsense out there, Apple Pro, and so on. So it could be a case where body morphology, body use contributes to understanding the experience environment, whether it stays the same or not. However, the key here is the sensory organs, how moving and manipulating them can possibly cause changes in the underlying brain systems, maybe one or maybe more than one. Interesting. And that's certainly the case with virtual reality. Your external, this external is not changing, but when you're virtual, that's the reality in that box, and your eyes are seeing, for example, a desert, even though you're in a room in Europe. And after that, in the next slide, or I guess in the next video, in the next stage of whatever the case might be, you're on top of a skyscraper. So the external environment, according to what the authors are saying here, and from a neuroconstructivist point of view, you don't need to exchange your external environments per se. It's more the case of the neural activity that is experienced through, again, sensory organs, and manipulation of the environment itself can be crucial despite you not changing the external environment. Because think about it, when you put your virtual reality headset device on, your external reality is no longer this room, right? Your external reality is now that which is virtual. And it's momentarily fake, of course. However, that experienced environment, let's call it environment one, will produce neural activity and representations and affect your neural structures. Let's say that's effect one. So let's say E1. So EV1, environment one, and E1, experience one, will not be the same as, let's say, EV2 here, because now we have E2, experience 2. However, they still seem to be possibly parallel. How? Well, body morphology possibly can explain that, because my body, when I have those goggles on, is the same body when I was in this room, unless I do something drastic, which again can affect in a more inductive way, affect the neural structures and my experience of the environment. That's why I gather from this. Fairly complicated if you aren't familiar with the terminology, but inshallah my aim here is to give you an idea here, and so give you a more clearer picture of these type of concepts. So really interesting, because I've been trying to explore this for some time now. And ayahs of the Quran, I mean, for example, Surah Al-Kahf, when you read the portion of Dhul Qurnayn, when he goes as Allah commands him, and he sees the sun going into the murky waters, which of course doesn't mean the sun goes into it, comes out of it. It's the angle upon which he's viewing it. There is a point of view that states that okay, there might be a portal involved, there might be different dimension, space and time are different, so on and so forth. But then the question now is, prophets and messengers, they experience certain environments far different than us normal human beings. So how does neuroscience connect with the deen? Well, so far it's given us insight, well, comprehensive insight into how our systems change and how they are able to adapt. Why they change, neuroscience does not have a complete explanation, because the why lies in the Quran and the how is more what science seeks to address. So next concept here is the embodiment view emphasizes that proactivity in exploring the environment is a core aspect of cognitive development. The child does not passively absorb information, but through manipulating the environment selects the experiences from which to learn. It also shows that what can be called the classic model of cognition, the mind acquiring rich representations of the external world, operating offline on these representations and generating an output, neglects the important aspect of real-time interactions with the changing world. An embodied alternative to the classic view emphasizes multiple real-time adjustments to the coupled brain-body-environment system to coordinate between inner and outer worlds. Brain-body-environment system, multiple real-time adjustments. I mean, wallahi, this is just something that neuroscientists are trying so hard to explain without Allah. Now, how would I explain this in the context of Islam? Well, with my limited knowledge, what I would say, for instance, when it comes to the multiple real-time adjustments to the coupled brain-body environment system, right, to coordinate between inner and outer worlds. So these are three not different but similar concepts that are trying to be that are infused together by researchers here. Researchers, I'll mention them as well: Klein, Vijge, Ballard, and Greenhoff, 1997. A lot of folks from the Netherlands do a lot of research in this area. A lot of researchers in the decision making and memory domains of neuroscience. Anyway, so real-time adjustments. We know as Muslims that death is inevitable. We do not live our life, I mean Muslims with a capital M, thinking okay, tomorrow is promised. Tomorrow is not promised. In fact, nothing's promised. But we live with this expectation that okay, I fix my habits from now to the next 30 days and I will see incremental progress. How do you know you'll be alive in the next 30 days? Well, it's that brain-body environment system. But I will actually remove brain and put heart, and I'll remove body and put soul. Because the heart and the soul is exactly the system that Islam is trying to inform us, so that we can inculcate and coordinate between the inner and outer worlds. So inner world is my cognition of the environment, memory, word processing, facial recognition, habits, understanding, numbers, mathematics, colors, smells, so on and so forth. Outer worlds is what's out there. Tree, its color. Flower, its scent. Cake, its taste. Parents, their faces. Friends, their voices. You get the point. So these are constantly changing, and at some point they will cease to exist. The tree, the cake, family members, the voices, it will be all gone. And this is what the Quran and the Ahadith mention. In fact, the destroyer of all pleasures is death. Hadith, Sahih Hadith from Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and it's true. It's true. Just going back to the concept mentioned here of embrainment, I believe. Yeah, the concept of embrainment. Look, there are connections that die, and because they die, our system, specific neural systems, become narrow and narrow and narrow and compete for cognitive space because the previous space has been died off. Has become available because the previous occupants have died off. Previous neurons, occupants in this case meaning neurons, and it's taken over by the more dominant neural structures. So yeah, that's how I would see it from a Muslim point of view. There's so much to explore. I mean, in terms of environment, the Quran speaks extensively about that. Surah Al-Rum comes to mind, and Surah Al-Ankabut comes to mind. In fact, I've written an article for those interested, From Crawling to Certainty, and I am extremely fascinated by developmental psychology and cognitive neuroscience. And it's incredible how Allah has created such a complex yet at times simple being, which is certainly a testament to Allah's power, His knowledge, and His mercy, that He doesn't, for instance, paralyze us when we decide not to pray. Gives us a chance. You may or may not die, and you ask for repentance, and repentance is very powerful. Again, concepts such as repentance, gratitude, envy, jealousy, pride, justice, empathy, these are all inner and outer world realities. And neuroscience, like I've mentioned not too long ago in this video, cannot be addressed without neuroscience merging with philosophy and with some form of theology, right? That's why you have neurophilosophy, for instance. It's a school of philosophy and a section of neuroscience that has come into the scenes, has jumped on the scene a few decades ago, and I don't think it's something that is very popular because of the various flaws, because the philosophy used in neuroscience is not that which is Allah centered. It's more to do with existentialism and nonsense written by popular scientists, especially those who are more leaning towards atheism and neo-Darwinism. So Patricia Churchland, famous individual from that domain, and Mark Noble has also written some stuff on this. There's another famous book which I haven't finished yet because it's complex, just like this paper. In fact, more complex because they're trying to understand the philosophical foundations of neuroscience. In fact, that's the name of the book, Philosophical Foundations of Neuroscience. I mentioned in my previous video, we were discussing, I believe it was Thomas Kuhn's work, and talking about brilliant air, brilliant fire. That's a book I would love to share with everyone, because that is a neurophilosophy book. Came across that book from studying the philosophical foundations of neuroscience. So, point here is that these theories sound nice, but the reality is far more deeper, far more deeper. And so, inshallah, we're almost towards the end of this, and I'm not rushing. I'm just conscious of time, because I tend to read some Qur'an or watch something in relation to the Qur'an before I sleep, so it sits in my brain nicely. So, ensorcelment. The specific environment in which the developing child is situated has a highly constraining effect on the emergence of neural representations, because it restricts the possible experiences of the child and offers to her certain ways in which it can be manipulated. These constraints refer mainly to the physical properties of the environment. Another source of constraints concerns the social aspects of the environment. For example, the interactions between a caregiver and her child. It has long been recognized that synchronous interactions between mother and child have a strong effect on the development of a secure attachment, the expression of emotions, mentioning that earlier, social and cognitive development, reviewed in Harris and Wolf, 2002. By contrast, disrupting a normal mother-infant relationship and exposure to early stresses such as death of a caregiver, child abuse or neglect can have profound effects on the neural and behavioral development of the infant. No to transgenderism, disgusting homosexual individuals who end up adopting children. It's disgusting. Anyway, Cerulli, Berry, and Aleva, 2003, Kaufman, Plotsky, Namaroff, and Charnay, 2000. I mean, this is not brand new information. Once there is disharmony in something that is harmonious already, i.e., the child-father relationship, and then you try and enter a synthetic, artificially made relationship such as man, woman, or trans man, trans woman, or trans woman and trans man, or trans X and man, woman, and the 60 plus genders that exist. How do you expect things to work in harmony? Likewise, our system in our body, and we've all been guilty of this, making our body consume sugar, tobacco, salt, butter, other processed foods and drink, whereas things like black seed, honey, ashwagandha, sea moss, chlorophyll, nitric oxide, these are the things you have to give your body. Put it this way, anything you can't put in your mouth, you shouldn't put on your skin. So the best thing for your skin will always be jojoba oil or jojoba oil, coconut oil. Some use castor oil. I find that to be great. And avoid any synthetic shampoos and soaps. And for your teeth, find a good tooth powder. Right? At the end of the day, you only have one body. And this is an amana to Allah, and every day we fault and falter, but look, at the end of the day, that's the process of being human. That's the process of being human. Now, one thing that's unique about human beings are the interactions we have, right? So in terms of interactions, this is what paper says. Interactions between constraints. The described constraints on neural development interact in different ways to shape the construction of representations in the brain. Figure 4. Neural development itself depends on experience-derived neural activity, which can lead to changes in gene expression. Experience-dependent changes not only occur in the formation of within-region networks, but also in between-region pathways. Interactions with the social environment have effects on both neural development and on the expression of genes. Eisenberg, 1995. These effects can either be mediated through direct experience with the environment or through altered caregiver behavior and in a specific environment. Sel Putigiano, Cancela, Landis, Ciurelli, Berardi, and Maffei. Okay, so interaction between, so the constraints in and of itself can also interact with each other. Quite fascinating. Put together in the development of cognitive processing, these constraints form an interactive network shaping the neural structures that form the basis of mental representations. Now, this is one of the key aspects of the paper, in my humble opinion. The nature of representation, something I was questioning and querying at the start of this video. What are these representations? What are the nature and how do they come to be now? So far, we've explored how these representations possibly seemingly come to be. Now is the nature of these representations. So, how can the multiple biological and environmental constraints that shape the neural system inform our understanding of the nature of mental representations? From the constraints on the development of neural structures, we have derived a number of principles that categorize the emergence of representations. So the author, one of them, Dennis Marshall, 2007. Okay, now, this is key. And inshallah, this is one of those situations where through my notes, I shall be touching on these other concepts. So, according to the authors, the main principle is context dependence. Okay? Sounds like a very straightforward thing, but you never know what to expect. On all levels of analysis, the shaping of neural structures giving rise to mental representations is highly dependent on the context in which these structures develop. Okay, so the neural structures, the shaping of neural structures giving rise to mental representations, so the structures that give rise to the mental representation is highly dependent on the context in which these structures develop. So I'm guessing trauma, fear, happiness, joy, reward, punishment. These are just things that are coming to my mind from the behavior literature. Okay, this is true for the cellular context of the individual neuron, for interactions between brain regions, and for the physical and social environmental context of the child. How do you even know that? It's impossible to get all this information from the cell of a child. Anyway, like the underlying neural structures, mental representations are shaped by processes involving competition and cooperation. Okay, so you have neural competition and neural cooperation. Neural competition and neural cooperation. Right, fascinating. Competition ensures that the developing components of a system become specialized on different aspects of processing, driving the system towards representing new information. That sounds like economic competition as well. Competition ensures that the developing components of a system become specialized on different aspects of processing. AI, for example, driving the system towards representing new information, new product, APIs, LLMs, so on. By contrast, cooperation, okay, so this is more of a contrast. By contrast, cooperation leads to the integration of separate components, allowing existing knowledge to be reused. So this sounds possibly like a phonological loop. Sorry, not sounds like, but it reminds me of a phonological loop in memory studies, where you have a visual sketch, phonological loop, sequential memories, episodic memories. Okay. Furthermore, instead of passive absorption of environmental information, representation construction relies on proactivity of the child in exploring and manipulating and interacting with their environment. Again, this is what the Qur'an encourages, for us to go out and look at Allah's wonders. I gave the reference earlier of Surah Ar-Rum and Surah Al-Ankabut. Quite interesting. We mentioned here. Now, the emergence of representation supporting cognitive behavior is strongly constrained by the ontological history of the individual. Of course, the existential aspect plays a key role. The events occurring at a given time constrain the range of possible adaptations available to the system in the future. Example, war, disease, so on. The notion of progressive specialization is shared by many constructivist theories. Jean Piaget, famous behaviorist, although he studied animals, wrote extensively on childhood development and looks like a dodgy guy, to be fair. Someone I would not want my children to be around. Anyway, apart from the interesting metaphysical positions though, apart from the current representations, new representations also depend on the current learning environment and the current developmental state of the child's body. The developmental trajectory is determined by the innate challenges facing the child and not by goal-directed convergence on an adult state. Developmental trajectory is determined by immediate challenges. Yeah, because when you're at your most feeble, most weak, that's when you're looking to tackle the immediate challenges. Immediacy is priority. Whereas when you become an adult, goal-directed convergence. Yeah, so now you're directing all your energy focused in one domain, and that domain may produce different results based on what that domain is. Domain, for example, is learning a new skill, enhancing a skill you have already, or looking to reignite a skill you have. For example, sales is a very goal-directed convergence process, although certain sales systems can be divergent but still customer-centered. For example, spin selling, situation, purpose, intention, needs, payoff, very converging, goal directing, because you're walking a prospect down to the end goal, which is essentially close and then buying. Divergent, I assume possibly a case where you have a call, potential customer, a lead, and then they go back, and then they go back to their team, and then they come back to yourself, have a second call, probably a third core, but in this case you are now having more people from your side, a technical person and possibly operations or marketing person who can aid and assist any hesitation the lead would have from a, again, technical marketing perspective. Again, I guess it depends on the product and service you're selling, but the point is that, yeah, it for sure applies, and I agree with this to a large degree. And Islam actually speaks of the immediate challenges and future goals that we must have in our adult stages. So it's not entirely separated, but in fact they, funny enough, converge together. So as a child, we're trying to learn the basics of the deen, and when we become an adult, we have to be as perfect as we possibly can in terms of learning the Quran, the Arabic language, the tajweed, and the various styles of the Quran. Of course, the history and the seerah, which is the biography of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So these aspects are very important. So yeah, proactivity of children and of course adults, learning never stops. Learning never ever stops. Despite many cultures that are the antithesis of this form of thinking. Alhamdulillah for Islam. Back to the paper. Any new representations therefore only need to be sufficiently powerful to improve performance without the current developmental context. This improvement can often be achieved by small and fragmentary additions to existing mental representations. Okay, I see what they're saying. This view suggests that the brain does not construct central, fully detailed, singular representations of the environment. So there's various representations, not one single representation. Right. I mean, a famous trick I can do with you right now is look at all the green things that are in your room, or that are at least closest to the color green, right? Green, 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 close to green. Now, if I ask you how many red things there were, you weren't really focusing on the red. You were counting the green. I can't even say right now. At the top of my head, 2, about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Got quite a lot of red books, but point is, adding to existing mental representations. So yeah, this view suggests that the brain does not construct central, fully detailed, singular representations of the environment. Instead, partial representations are fragmented and distributed across a range of brain regions. Excuse me. Such distributed modality-specific representations have recently become a focus of research in adult concepts. So, in the adult concepts, modality-specific representations, and it makes sense because your PFC, prefrontal cortex, again, there's varying agreements on here. By the age of 25 or up until the age of 40, males and females. Although females, their journey of maturation begins earlier. But on average, 25 to 40 is the timeline that's more or less seemingly apparent of once your brain fully forms. modality specific representations. Yeah, so if I ask you right now, can you think of the Japanese culture? You have a few things in mind: a katana sword, noodles, anime, Dragon Ball Z, Nintendo, atomic bomb, maybe some film or TV show, the language, so on and so forth. Now, if I say to you, I want you to think about the culture of Zambia, far more challenging. Now, this is modality specific because now you have to look up Zambian culture, the language, the capital, the flag, where it's on the map. In fact, most don't even know where Japan probably is on the map. So I can see why adult specific studies are now a thing, though this paper is from almost 20 years ago, still very relevant in my opinion. Because neuroconstructivism, so far what we've studied, seems to me to align not entirely but 70% of it, in my humble opinion, aligns with the Islamic perspective of development of man and how we learn and navigate through our environment and the sensory experiences and the underlying representations and substrates that allow us to form thoughts and opinions and exercise actions, build motivations, or at least construct ulterior motivations that could lead to a higher motivation. So, pretty solid, man, so far. Everything else, I will cover this figure here now, figure 4. So, figure 4, multiple interacting constraints shaping the construction of representations. Neural activation patterns in a specific cortical region, which is region X, which should be on the left side. Region X here is not a primary sensory area, so that the effects of environmental changes are mediated through other cortical regions. Representations can affect their own progressive change through multiple loops involving genes, other brain areas, the body, and the environment. So figure 4 is the interaction between these constraints. Fascinating. So they've broken down these constraints into genes, encelment, embrainment, embodiment, and ensocialment. So all these elements tie in to eventually the nature as well of these representations. Okay, fascinating. Right, so one of the last sections now. Last section are the implications of the neuroconstructivist viewpoint. The described view of cognitive development as an emergent outcome of multiple interactive constraints on the construction of neural networks allows for a unified view of normal and abnormal development as well as development and adult processing. Developmental disorders can be understood through altering constraints that push the development trajectory off its normal track to reach a different end state. Thus, atypical development can, like typical development, be characterized as an adaptation, to multiple interacting constraints, only that the constraints are different. So in ensocialment, for example, adapting constraint changes. So let's say you move from a normal city urban environment into a war zone. Okay, that's straightforward. These atypical constraints then lead to different outcomes through the same processes of representation and construction. This explanation of typical development stands in contrast to theories which assume that disorders arise from isolated failures of particular functional modules. For example, the failure of an innate dedicated theory of mind module in autism. Neurodivergence definitely is an area that neuroconstructivism can't work in, can't function in even post lesion situations. For example, famous patient HM with memory issues. To a degree it can, but it can't at the same time. But then again, patient HM was very unique. Or selective damage to genetically pre-specified syntactic module in specific language impairment SLI. Okay. Instead, due to the context-dependent nature of development, atypicalities in one part of the system are likely to have ramifications in other parts within the system and in interactions with the environment, leading to a final state that is optimally adapted to the specific set of constraints. The neuroconstructivist framework also provides an integrated view of development and adult processing because the adult state is viewed as merely a more stable state along the developmental trajectory, really, with vape and alcohol and manipulation through screens and narratives that are political and economical. I don't think there's any stability. Neural processing, yeah, I think from that point of view, to a degree, again, I agree. From this perspective, the investigation of adult processing benefits from being analyzed through a developmental lens to reveal which constraints have shaped development to reach the adult state. Adult cognitive processing is often characterized as consisting in a set of qualitatively different specialized domain-specific modules. The neuroconstructivist perspective instead focuses on how regions of functional specialization are formed, given the outlined constraints, providing explanations of adult processing that are less focused on qualitatively different encapsulated modules. The neuroconstructivist perspective instead focuses on how regions of functional specialization are formed given the outlined constraints, providing explanations of adult processing that are less focused on qualitatively different encapsulated modules. Right, okay. Neural network and robotic modeling offers an excellent tool for understanding development from a neuroconstructivist perspective. Marshall Sirios 2007, Thomas Carmeloff Smith 2003, Westerman 2006. This is because in models, different constraints such as network structure, mechanism of neural information processing, and experience-dependent structural change, environmental complexity, and the ability to interact with the environment. Right. Can be systematically varied, and the effect of this variation on performance can be investigated in detail. These modules therefore offer the opportunity to explore the link between multiple interacting biological and environmental constraints. Neurodevelopment and the development of cognitive representations. That sentence is not coherent. These models therefore offer the opportunity to explore the link between multiple interacting biological and environmental constraints. Right, okay. Conclusions. Alhamdulillah, we're at the end. Neuroconstructivism offers a theoretical framework in which cognitive development is closely linked to the development of the underlying neural structures in the brain by characterizing the constraints that operate on the development of neural structures that support the mental representations. Cognitive development is explained as a trajectory emerging from the interplay, as mentioned in figure 3 and 4, of these constraints. This view provides a unified framework for analyzing normal and abnormal development, and it offers a view of adult processing as an outcome of development. Importantly, and in contrast to other approaches to psychological research, neuroconstructivism implies that the widely accepted independence of levels of description defended by Marr 1982 does not hold. Well, I'm not sure what Marr's argument is. Instead, consistency between levels is necessary because the interactions across levels, computations on Marr's computational level, have direct effects on the hardware level, which changes the processing algorithm through progressive representation construction, leading to new computation with further effects on the hardware. I guess Marr is more of a computational neuroscientist, it seems. I don't know. Progress in research in neuroconstructivist framework will be made by a better understanding of the constraints operating on neurodevelopment, by improved methods of linking brain and behavior in developing children, and by computational modeling, which has the potential to offer explanations of the interaction between brain cognitive development. Computational modeling. I mean, cognitive modeling, understanding intelligence, SI theory, crystallized intelligence, fluid intelligence. Yeah, I mean, you can't again define the abstract with some concrete processes. But anyway, Alhamdulillah, we finished this fascinating paper. A lot to look over. All in all, what I've realized is that Allah is calling us towards Him when He informs and instructs us to go out there, explore the world, and as the Quran mentions that we have created you in various tribes, giving you languages and different looks so you can recognize and benefit each other. So there certainly is a benefit of coming across such perspectives and theories. Definitely opens, or at least it opened my eyes in terms of how complex human beings are and how different constraints, according to neuroconstructivists, affect our gene expression, brain regions, processing of our daily lives, memory formation, habits, learning words, processing face and recognizing faces, and distinguishing between external environments and understanding how that allows us to analyze our inner and outer worlds, so on and so forth. So not a bad paper. Inshallah, next we will be touching on what will we be touching on? I'd like to touch on some theology. I'd like to touch on some A.J. Arbery, hopefully, inshallah, and more neuroscience, inshallah, in the future, and philosophy as well, inshallah, and breaking down books and understanding. There's a lot of niches I like to step into: cultural neuroscience, neurophilosophy, Islam, and for example, prenatal, postnatal development, so on and so forth. So, inshallah, bi'ithnillah, with Allah's permission, we will continue this mind, matter, meaning journey. Ameen, ameen. Till next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.